Welcome. My name is Marshall Miller, and I'm the chair of the White Collar Crime Committee of the New York City Bar Association. And I'm happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the New York City Bar Association to the 2022 White Collar Crime Institute. I'm so pleased that we're able to do this in person after so many months and years of virtual conferences. It's so much better to do it with all of you in person. And to have such an exciting speaker as we do today and such a star-studded program, which I think you'll enjoy throughout the day. We're going to do this first part of the event as a fireside chat, except exchanging the fire for a few hundred lawyers. So that'll be comfortable, I'm sure. And it's my great honor to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker, Lisa O. Monaco, the 39th Deputy Attorney General of the United States. By way of introduction, I'd like to say a few words about Lisa's remarkable career in public service. Early in her career, Lisa served as an assistant United States attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, trying cases and earning her stripes in the trenches as a federal prosecutor. Lisa later was chosen to serve on the Enron task force, a high-stakes, high-profile assignment in the arena of white-collar crime and prosecution. Lisa's held key leadership positions at the Department of Justice, first as counsel to Attorney General Janet Reno, later as Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General.
Boy, Marshall.
I know, you're away for a few years, you lose all the acronyms.
We'll remedy that.
Yes. Then as the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, where she served as the first woman to hold that critically important position, and now as Deputy Attorney General. Lisa's also served our country in key law enforcement and national security roles as Chief of Staff to then FBI Director Robert Mueller and as President Obama's Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor, coordinating all aspects of the executive branch's approach to national security issues and events. For her work, Lisa has received countless awards, including DOJ's highest honor, the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Service. But I just want to pause on one key data point that I think is most illustrative of the universal respect that Lisa enjoys at the highest levels of our profession and also of the U.S. government across agency and across party lines. When Lisa was nominated by President Biden for her current position as Deputy Attorney General back in 2021, you might have expected a tense and grueling confirmation process with a razor-thin margin. And while Lisa can tell us later if it was grueling, it certainly went about as well as it possibly could have, despite the highly charged political environment and Lisa's long track record of service for senators to review and possibly second guess. In a testament to her leadership and her commitment to advancing the public good, she was confirmed by an overwhelming vote of 98-2. And that's quite an achievement, particularly when political chasms divide our nation as they do. So we're very fortunate to have Lisa join us this morning at the New York City Bar Association to kick off our conference. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's great to be back in New York. It's great to be out of Washington, acronyms and all. When I was out of government over the last few years, I enjoyed what I lovingly referred to as dual citizenship status, because I split my time between D.C. and here in New York. I was privileged to be able to teach a little law, air quotes on the teach part of that, at NYU Law School, where I did a seminar on national security law and policy. And so really great to be back in New York. So thank you for having me.
Yes. Well, before we jump into the heart of the matter for this white-collar crime audience, I thought maybe we could start with a recent event on the minds of many New Yorkers, and that is the subway shooting in Brooklyn earlier this month. And I think this is maybe your first visit since then, and I wondered if you would say a few words to us about the shooting and the Department of Justice's efforts to combat violent crime and acts of terror.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, first, I was just visiting yesterday the Eastern District of New York, your former office, Marshall, and had the opportunity to sit down with the prosecutors and the investigators on that case and get a briefing on that case. First of all, let me say it was a remarkable testament to the partnership that the U.S. Attorney's Office enjoys with federal, state, and local law enforcement partners. When an event like that happens, and there is immediate, chaos and questions, is this the first of a string of attacks, or is this an isolated event? And nobody knows, as you know, having prosecuted terrorism cases when you were an assistant U.S. attorney, it is an incredibly tense time in the immediate moments and hours after an event like that. And what is incredible is that within 8 hours, because of the great work, the great partnership between the NYPD, the FBI, the ATF, the Brooklyn DA's office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, the suspect was identified, and then within 12 hours was detained and had a hearing and is, of course, continues to be detained on the charges brought by the Eastern District of New York. The other thing that is, I think, quite remarkable is the attack by the shooter. 10 people shot, mercifully and thankfully no fatalities. But the quick work between the tracing of the gun, the subpoenas issued, dozens of subpoenas issued, search warrants issued for the information that he left behind, the U-Haul truck that he had parked nearby that had further identifying information, was just an incredible example of the teamwork and the partnership that we need to be able to, of course, respond to acts like this, but also to the violent crime that unfortunately we're seeing spike in a number of cities. And you see that at work also, that partnership at work with the federal, state, and local partners going after the most significant drivers, which is the strategy we are putting out to all the U.S. attorneys, including those here in New York, to go after the most significant drivers of violent crime, including and especially the gun violence that is unfortunately gripping this city and many others.
I think another topic on the mind of everyone, and this isn't just in New York, but across the globe, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing conflict there. The U.S. government, of course, has been active in responding to that conflict, including through the levying of a far-reaching slate of sanctions. But there's also been discussion of a whole-of-government approach to responding to the invasion. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the Department of Justice's role in that whole-of-government approach.
Sure. This is something that I've seen evolve over my career. You mentioned in your introduction that I've held a number of roles. I've worked and been privileged to work in the department before, during, and after the events of 9/11, which I think set our government and, of course, the Department of Justice on a changed course when it comes to responding to national security issues. At that time, of course, the forces of international terrorism. But over the last 2 decades, the Department of Justice has evolved to be a major player in national security discussions, responses, foreign policy issues, and I have seen that from a front row seat. So what we are doing in response to the current crisis spans the intelligence mission that is front and center for the FBI. It's got over 100 legal attaches around the world, and they've drawn on those and working with their international partners to be part of the intelligence community. So they are contributing to the whole of government response when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, using their intelligence mission. My old division, the National Security Division, working with them on a host of issues. When it comes to the cyber response, we have a front row seat in that. Folks will have seen, I hope, in the last couple of weeks, we worked with our partners to take down a GRU botnet. Now, I'll unpack some of the acronyms here. GRU is the Military Intelligence Unit of the Russian military. And they had seeded and used basically an army of what amounts to zombie computers that could be used to deploy malware, malicious code on a host of computers to do a number of things, to steal information, to deploy ransomware, to undertake destructive attacks, We don't know what they were going to use it for, but any one of those things could have been the aim of deploying this and using this botnet. We used traditional law enforcement tools, a search warrant, to use our cyber techniques to go in and basically excise that malware, excise that code from those computers so they could not be deployed to do harm in a whole host of ways. And then importantly, Marshall, we closed the door. Think of it, we closed the virtual door so the malicious cyber actors, in this case, the Russian GRU, couldn't get back in. So that is something that is us using traditional tools, criminal justice tools, authorities, in wholly new ways to be part of a response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the things that we think Russia is likely to do in response to the global response to their aggression. So that is just one example. The other things we're doing is when it comes to the war crimes investigation. You know, because you spent time down in Washington as the principal deputy in the criminal division, there's a whole section within the Justice Department's criminal division that is focused on investigating and prosecuting crimes of genocide, war crimes. They are known and historically made their name by being the Nazi hunters. Well, these specialists now are working with their European and Ukrainian partners to investigate and eventually, we hope, prosecute instances of atrocities and war crimes going on in Ukraine. There have been a number, unfortunately, of U.S. victims, some of them journalists, who have been killed as part of the aggression in Ukraine. So we are involved there. And then, of course, you'll hear later from Andrew Adams, who's the terrific prosecutor who is now heading up our task force klepto capture, and we can discuss our naming conventions later. But that is our effort to use our criminal justice tools to go after the sanctions busting and the sanctions evasion and the Russian oligarchs who, in effect, have enabled and helped Russia's aggression and have propped up Russia's aggression over time and have been part of kind of Putin's set of cronies. And we're doing everything we can to deprive them and isolate them and deprive them of their ill-gotten gains.
I saw in a recent speech, Lisa, that you mentioned in the cybercrime arena that there was a shift towards prevention as well as prosecution. And I wonder if that grew a little bit out of some of the experiences at Joint Terrorism Task Forces and the approach to trying to combat acts of terror, not by prosecuting them after they happen, but by trying to prevent them.
It absolutely has, and it comes from, frankly, my experience, as I referenced before, seeing this arc of the Justice Department's role in national security matters. Of course, the past 2 decades, the focus on preventing the next terror attack, and we shifted quite literally our orientation on this, whether it's the FBI transforming, and I was privileged, you mentioned, to work with FBI Director Mueller to help him transform that institution from an investigative agency that focuses only on investigating crimes after the fact to being a national security organization focused on preventing the next attack. That's the evolution that organization has undergone in the last 2 decades. Similarly, the National Security Division that I had the privilege to lead was set up in direct response to 9/11 to sit side by side intelligence and criminal prosecutors to come together to prosecute terrorist crimes, to prosecute espionage, to go after nation-state cyber attackers. So we've really shifted our orientation when it comes to terrorism issues. We have to do the same thing when it comes to cyber attacks, in particular nation-state cyber attacks. So what I have been trying to preach is exactly that changed orientation. We need to be very nimble. We need to use our tools, not to wait, and we will always be interested in prosecuting criminals and hackers, but we have to do our part in preventing the next victim. So you will have seen several months ago in response to the Colonial Pipeline attack, what we did was, thankfully, because Colonial came forward, shared with us, shared with the FBI and the Justice Department, critical information, we were able to use that information to follow the money, use a time-honored technique of prosecutors and investigators to literally follow the ransomware payment made by Colonial Pipeline and seize it back from the hacker's crypto wallet and return that money and a portion of it to the Colonial Pipeline Company. That's the kind of proactive work with the victims of cyber attacks that we want to do to encourage companies to come forward. All of you who are representing said companies, this is a message for you. We really want victims to come forward. We don't want them to be re-victimized in that process. We want companies to share that information with us because it's only in doing that that we can work with them to both get back some ransom that may be paid, but importantly, to help stop the next company from being victimized. So that is really the focus of our cyber efforts, and we're changing the structure in the Justice Department for how we do this. So we have deployed to all of the U.S. Attorney's offices a directive to say, when there's a ransomware attack or some other breach in your district affecting a company in your district, we want you to report it, just like we have done historically with terrorism acts, because we need to have a national picture of what the threat is.
Lisa, you gave an important and I think well-discussed speech on white-collar crime a few months ago at the ABA White-Collar Conference.
I know you didn't say well-received, Marshall.
Well, the spirited discussion is one form of
it absolutely
well-received.
Yeah.
You made a particular observation there that I wanted to dig into. You remarked that in considering the overall law enforcement landscape from where you sit as the Deputy Attorney General, you were struck by the degree to which corporate crime has an increasing national security dimension. And I wondered if you could tell us a little more about what you're seeing in that intersection between corporate crime and national security.
So I am seeing this increasing intersection between national security issues and corporate crime and corporate criminal enforcement, whether it's the sanctions issues. You know, sanctions is not just for banks anymore, as those of you who are advising multinational companies know or should know. This is an area, and in your discussion of the unprecedented, wide-ranging sanctions that the U.S. government, working with our partners and allies, have been able to impose on Russia, that's affecting companies beyond the financial services sector. Got to be thinking, if you're a company in the supply chain realm, you know, what those sanctions mean for you. So sanctions issues are a critical piece of this intersection when it comes to corporate criminal enforcement and national security issues. The crypto set of issues, right? We're seeing, obviously, cryptocurrency being an increasingly attractive area and volatile area for investment, which can always spawn interesting work for those of us in my business. But we're also seeing it being used for sanctions evasion, for money laundering. So I think there's a set of issues here that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of. But when it comes to sanctions being used as a tool of, frankly, financial statecraft, which is what we're seeing vis-a-vis the Russia aggression in Ukraine, that is going to have ripple effects for companies beyond the financial services sector, and it's something I think we very much have to be mindful of.
So starting then with how this impacts DOJ, as you see an increasing intersection there between corporate crime and national security, how is DOJ addressing that? Are you shifting priorities? Are you investing in that area? How does that impact the work of the department?
Well, one way it impacts the work, or the way we are changing the way we do business, is you're seeing, and you will see, a lot more kind of multidisciplinary approaches and teams to investigate these activities. So one example is task force klepto capture, right? So we are drawing on the money laundering and sanction enforcement expertise within the Department of Justice and the Treasury Department. We are drawing on, of course, our cyber crime investigators, both in the criminal division and in the national security division. We are working with the intelligence community. I am every morning getting a product in my morning intelligence briefing that I sit down with the Attorney General, the FBI Director, and we are getting information from the intelligence community about where those assets are that belong to sanctioned individuals. That is information pooled by our intelligence community being used and served up to our investigators and prosecutors. You wouldn't have seen that years ago, that kind of interaction to help feed our enforcement efforts.
Well, as a plug for the rest of the conference, we're going to hear from DOJ leaders. We're obviously going to hear from Andrew Adams, the head of the task force klepto capture, but also from leaders of the cyber and crypto enforcement side of DOJ at panels later. So everybody can look forward to that.
Public service announcement.
Yes, exactly. So what about on the corporate side and on the private sector side? How do you think companies should be thinking about national security laws and ensuring corporate compliance?
Well, I think you've got to be factoring in, and as you're having discussions with your clients, I think they have got to be factoring in this changed landscape. I think, one way to think about this is as sanctions being the new FCPA, which is a phrase only this crowd could appreciate.
Are you going to trademark that? That sounds like maybe a T-shirt.
Yeah.
Sanctions is the new FCPA. I'll make them and sell them later.
There you go. But I think it's true. The way that multinational corporations have to think about how these sanctions regimes are going to be affecting them and their businesses, I think is critically important. It's something they should be having conversations about. The know your customer rules that we are now asking, for instance, crypto exchanges and those who do business with crypto exchanges to adopt, that is the wave of the future, right? So kind of importing things that we saw in one realm, whether it's FCPA, whether it's in the know your customer realm, and importing them to this new landscape, whether it's in crypto issues, whether it's in sanctions enforcement, those are the things that I think and hope and would encourage you to be talking to your clients about.
And do you see that spreading beyond, I think, industries which have already been, I think, pretty focused on sanctions and export control laws? I'm thinking of the financial industry, export, high-tech manufacturing. Some, I think, industries have been very locked in on this, but I think in other industries it's been less of a priority. And do you see that shifting?
Absolutely. And whether it's the combination of the global supply chain, the effects that we've seen COVID have on it, there's been a heightened focus on supply chain issues, but now the sanctions issues have a ripple effect to every company that could be involved in a particular supply chain, in a particular, chip manufacturing process, you name it. I think companies that do heavy exports are going to need to be focusing on these things.
Springboarding off what you said about sanctions potentially being the new FCPA from the point of view of corporate compliance, in the FCPA realm, there is guidance that's a lot clearer to companies around what would happen, for example, if a company self-reports. Mm-hmm. What can a company expect? Do you foresee that kind of guidance in this area as well, or other ways that this area of compliance and enforcement will develop towards that direction?
It's an interesting question, and it's probably something that we could be developing more guidance on. I think we're, in the process of kind of building the airplane a little bit as we're flying it, as we, new sanctions are coming out almost on a weekly basis, right? And so I think we have to be, we do owe it, I think, to companies and those who advise them to be as transparent as we can be in terms of what we're expecting. But more broadly, Marshall, you referenced the speech I gave, I think at least obliquely, back in October when it comes to what this administration and this Justice Department and I and the Attorney General are focusing on when it comes to corporate criminal enforcement. And there it has been a kind of return to kind of what's old is new again, individual accountability, and frankly, and I think newly, a focus on recidivism. And the fact that when I came back to the Justice Department after having been gone for a few years and was trying to evaluate where we were in the corporate criminal enforcement landscape, I asked my team for some data, and it turned out almost 20% of the major corporate resolutions that we had engaged in over the last several years involved companies that were repeat players and had previously had NPAs or DPAs. Now, that was an interesting revelation, and it told me that we needed to be looking hard at how we are evaluating when a company and if a company should get successive DPAs. And that is something we are looking very hard at, which is one of the reasons why you acknowledged that the speech was not necessarily well received, but received. But that's the kind of thing I think we need to be evaluating and then providing additional guidance, which is what we're doing.
What would you expect of a company that unearthed a lack of compliance with national security laws, whether through a whistleblower or maybe an acquisition of a new subsidiary and integration revealed lack of compliance? What would you hope for? What would you expect? And how would you, assuming that what you'd hope for is self-disclosure,
Yep.
How do you incentivize that?
So I absolutely would hope for self-disclosure. And coming forward and being as forthright as possible about, and this is what we have said in our guidance, all individuals involved in that activity. And I would expect that to be a continuing set of discussions with the Justice Department. And how do we incentivize that? By being very clear that that conduct will be rewarded, and the converse is true, right? In those instances where companies have not disclosed, where we have found it on our own, we're going to be treating those situations differently.
You mentioned a moment ago the renewed focus on individual accountability. Of course, that's always a focus for the Department of Justice. But there's big news, I think, today about an indictment in the Archagos case, charging the CEO and CFO with a host of charges from racketeering to market manipulation to securities and wire fraud. And I know you may be somewhat limited on what you can tell us, as much as I'd love to have you scoop the Southern District press conference to come, but we won't make you do that. Yeah. But can you talk a little bit more generally about what a case like this says about the focus on individual accountability, and in particular, it seems from the charges like this activity was involved in during the COVID era and some of the market volatility there. And I wonder if there's things you can talk about in terms of DOJ's approach to holding individuals accountable and COVID era fraud.
So I'd say a few things. First, I can't say more on the particular case. I will have more to say on it later this morning when I appear at a press conference with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. But what I think the tremendous work of that office, the prosecutors, investigators in SDNY shows in this case is it really typifies and exemplifies the focus we are placing on holding individuals accountable when it comes to corporate crime, when it comes to corporate malfeasance, and importantly, frankly, the speed with which this case has been developed. And you asked before, what is the message and what are we hoping to incentivize? I hope that the message we are sending, whether it's in this case, whether it's the cases where we have notified companies that prior DPAs have not been complied with and indicated that we have found breach, which we have done, and we are activating those breach clauses in those DPAs, and we have done that now publicly in a few cases. Those should all be messages to the companies and those who advise them that we will take very seriously those the obligations that a company has when they enter into one of those agreements, and we will not hesitate to enforce them. And importantly, though, what I want to do is incentivize a culture of compliance and corporate responsibility, and to frankly arm you and the GCs and the companies that you advise and the compliance heads of the companies that you advise to be able to have those, frankly, what I know are tough conversations. When I was out of government, I served on corporate boards. I know the tough conversations that end up happening and the resourcing trade-offs that have to happen when it comes to supporting and developing and resourcing a compliance program. And the idea behind a lot of this is to say, no, that it should be money well spent, and those are conversations that should be happening, and I want to arm those in those boardrooms to be having those conversations and making those decisions.
In the wake of the financial crisis, we saw that the volatility in the markets then either contributed to or exposed a lot of fraud, and cases came out of that of various kinds. And I wonder if you think sort of the COVID era is going to have a similar bump in investigations and cases and prosecutions, and if this is an example of that, as one aspect of it.
Well, we have deployed a lot of resources when it comes to COVID fraud enforcement. There's been some $5 trillion sloshing around in the system over the course of the pandemic, and anytime you've got that much money in the marketplace and kind of flooding the system here, it's going to be ripe for some folks to take advantage of that. We have established a COVID fraud enforcement team. We've named a director of that team to focus 100% of his time on bringing together all of the expertise, not only in the Justice Department, but across the federal government when it comes to the IRS, to the Inspector General community, to the other investigators in the Treasury Department, to really pool our resources and to go after the most sophisticated and oftentimes, frankly, Marshall, what we're seeing, transnational fraud schemes related to misuse of COVID fraud, or COVID enforcement and pandemic relief funds. So we are putting a lot of resources on this issue. We've already charged literally thousands of cases when it comes to COVID fraud, and there's a lot more to do.
So going back to another output of the speech that we've been talking about from the ABA conference, you announced the formation of the Corporate Crime Advisory Group, and to make you feel at home from Washington, I'm going to call it the CCAG.
There you go. Gotta love a good acronym. It
sounds very Washington.
You seem, Marshall, very at ease and fluent in the acronyms.
Well, I think I chaired the task force on acronyms when I was in Washington, and I did a really good job. But CCAG I like task force klepto capture. Those are kudos on those. At any rate, so talking about the CCAG then for a second, what role do you see it playing? What can we expect from that group? And how would you, I know there was some talk about the private sector interacting with the group, and I wonder what you have in mind there.
So it has been exceptionally active. I know because I've been meeting with the stakeholders that have been part of the CCAGs. See, now you got me doing it. Discussion. So I did establish this advisory group at the same time I made the speech in last October. And the charge to the CCAG was to come back to me with recommendations for how we should provide more guidance when it comes to the things I was just talking about. How are we going to look at recidivist companies when it comes to DPAs and NPAs? What further guidance can we be given when it comes to how we are looking at and evaluating monitors? The other thing I did in October was basically return the policy of the Justice Department when it comes to corporate monitors to what I call equipoise. There had been a policy of disfavoring the use of and imposition of corporate monitors. My view is that we should neither disfavor nor favor. We ought to take each case on its merits and make decisions based on the particular facts and circumstances of that investigation, of that case. We need to provide, we laid out a set of principles. I laid out a set of principles in October, and the job of the CCAG is to engage quite deliberately and quite widely with the private sector, with academics, with, frankly, civil society when it comes to criticisms of the Justice Department's enforcement, or in their view, sometimes lack thereof, of white-collar crime. So I have sat down with folks who have thought a lot and written a lot on these issues when it comes to the academic community. I've sat down with many of your colleagues in the white-collar defense bar and in multiple meetings, getting, frankly, good ideas, hearing input. And so what you can anticipate the output from that, from the CCAG's work, is fleshing out some of those principles, right? I said we should be looking at how and whether we enter into successive DPAs or NPAs. I said that we should be looking at the full range of conduct when it comes to an investigation of a corporation, right? But a 20-year-old bribery scheme isolated in one subsidiary in one part of the world is not going to be treated and shouldn't be treated the same as a pervasive, culture of misconduct in the company at the parent level. So we do need to look at the full range of conduct, but not everything will be treated equally.
We'll have a sign-up sheet later for everybody who wants to talk to the CCAG from the private sector. So we'll make sure all that happens.
Yep.
But I wonder. So I take it then that some of this is fleshing out of the principles. Mm-hmm. Do you see any big changes on the horizon? Do you foresee more that it's taking what's already been announced and providing greater clarity and guidance along the guideposts that you've already provided?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think what you will see is what folks have asked for and is quite right to provide, which is further clarity on how we will be applying the principles that I laid out in October. And we have already gotten some really good input and feedback and quite constructive discussions as we've been engaging in this outreach over the last many months. Mm.
Well, I mean, I'm sure as you experienced in your board service and your private sector experience, I think companies crave clarity in this area.
Absolutely.
So that they can try to meet what's expected of them. And so I think that's important work for the CCAG to be doing.
Absolutely.
I think we're coming up on time. I'm seeing the wave.
Okay.
Lisa, I'd like to thank you for coming and spending time with us this morning and kicking off our conference with your thoughtful input here. And we really appreciate it and wish you the best of luck the rest of the day with your press conference and also in the months to come.
Thanks very much. Thank you.